All right, everybody. So we have Eric Trexler with us today. He is completing his PhD at UNC, and today's charity is going to be for the. Can you explain the charity a little bit?
Yeah, it's Special Olympics North Carolina. Special Olympics is kind of like a global charity. The North Carolina branch. I've been volunteering, coaching their powerlifting team here in Durham County for going on 6 years now. It's an awesome charity. Special Olympics, all the athletes have some form of cognitive impairment and often physical impairments as well. And for a lot of athletes, going to training, going to events for Special Olympics is the highlight of their week, their month, their year. So it's an organization that does a ton of great work on a super tight budget. So if anyone out there is thinking of donating either your time or money, it really makes a huge difference for the athletes.
That's awesome. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do here, as I said in other interviews, is I work with Operation Smile, but everybody comes on, if they have a charity, that's what we donate towards. And that's a very unique one that you are intimately familiar with. So that's awesome, guys. If you like that cause, please help out. So a little bit more about Eric. So you competed in 2011 and 2013 in bodybuilding, correct?
Yeah, and 2017.
Oh, you did. Okay, I know you did that recently. Okay.
Yeah.
And what were your weights at each one?
Well, my first competition was my heaviest, and that's usually not a good thing.
Yeah.
It's usually a good lead.
Right.
So in 2011, I would compete 155, 160, and my stage weights keep going down because I keep getting leaner.
Yeah.
In 2017, I did 2 shows. I got my pro card, and then I made my pro debut.
Nice.
And in those, I was like between 140, 145 on stage.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, it was a big difference. Yeah, so I'm a good 10 to 15 pounds lighter on stage than my first show.
Yeah, wow, okay, cool. And so, when I first heard about you, it was because you had written the first proposal for a grant from the Bodybuilding Foundation, and that's going a few years back. But you were doing a study on metabolic adaptation, correct?
Yeah.
And what were the main findings that you looked into that? When you were looking at people who really got pretty much contest lean, what were those findings?
So yeah, what we did was it's kind of funny. So like you said, I competed in 2013, which was right when I started grad school, and I showed up to grad school like literally a week after my last show, and everyone's like, "Dude, you look and seem like you are a dead person." It was brutal.
Yeah.
They didn't recognize me when I showed up because I interviewed 40 pounds heavier.
Oh, wow, wow.
So the first few months of grad school were brutal. Just getting used to the new workload, new state, completely new. I moved several states away from home, totally on my own, and the post-competition process with all those stressors plus everything that prep put you through, it was wild. And I'd never really thought about kind of the aftermath of getting that lean. So we did 2 things. First, we wrote a review paper about metabolic adaptation in general. So I wrote that with Lane and Abby Smith-Ryan, who's my PhD advisor. And what we're trying to do is just lay out from a physiological perspective what exactly happens when pretty lean people get really lean. And what we did in writing that was, we kind of laid it out, put out the evidence that was available, which admittedly is not. In 2014, there wasn't a lot of bodybuilder research to really pick from. So it was borrowing from animal research, obesity research, and a few studies in athletes. So it became clear to us, someone needs to do a little bit more actual research in this population. But we also realized as we wrote it, we're like, man, all these things put you in a really bad spot after competition. And one thing, there was a few studies out there on preparation for bodybuilding, but almost all of them, it was like the day of the show, all right, we're done here, and everybody goes away. But the really interesting stuff happens after the show, when it's trying to get from getting a little leaner every single day to getting back to a normal body weight that you can actually maintain.
Sure.
So what we want to do with the study was take a look at them right around the time of the show, but also take a look at them in that immediate post-competition period just to see what the recovery process was starting to look like. And it was logistically very difficult because if you're trying to look at competition recovery, you've got to make sure every single participant is going to be geographically close to each other so you can measure them. But also it has to be their last competition of the year. Because if they're about to go do another competition in 4 weeks, then we're not actually looking at a post-competition period. We're looking at them just kind of maintaining.
Yeah, so finding a sample size for that would be pretty difficult.
It was brutal. And, so the sample size was pretty small, and that's why. It was tough. It took a year longer than I thought, and I actually ended up having to fly down to Florida to go collect data because that was where the data was. Usually you try to attract it to you. It's not even an option. I learned that Chapel Hill is not a bodybuilding hub.
Right.
But it was cool because what we could do is document where they were at the time of competition, but also where they were, a month or 2 later. And the whole idea was to kind of make a starting point at which other researchers could build off that and take a closer look at some of these time points. The real practical stuff, when we found them at the time of competition, they exhibited signs that were consistent with a slightly repressed metabolic rate, which we would expect. That's kind of the metabolic adaptation aspect of it. Their resting metabolic rate was a bit lower than we would have expected based on their lean tissue.
How much?
Off the top of my head, I'm not certain. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that in the paper we plotted individual points because we wanted to really show that, when you have, a small sample, I think it was somewhere around 15 people, giving a mean on that is informative, but we wanted to show the spread of where people were at.
Right.
And what's important with that, whenever you read bodybuilding research, trying to figure out, based on the means and the standard deviations, how many of these people were lean enough to really be dealing with this in a major way. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So there was quite a bit of spread. No one was more than, I don't think there were many people more than 15-ish% lower than we would expect, 15 or 20-ish, which is pretty consistent with other research. I have to double check the paper. It was
just to add my own anecdote, I had recently done it myself, and I didn't get a pre-measurement, but when they had taken my DMR, with the tubes and everything hooked up, their estimate for me was about 1900, and after, a probably 6-month-long diet, I was around 1440 is what they had me. So it was quite a significant difference from their estimate for me.
Yeah. And so the thing to keep in mind is, as you're going down, then obviously your estimated number's also going to go down as weight reduces. To some extent, it's going to depend on what equation you're using, what parameters go into that equation. But, to approximate it, you would expect it to be 10, 15-ish% below normal, or below what you would predict. And again, different equations are going to shift that number a little bit differently. But what our data showed was there was evidence that metabolic rate was a little below what we would expect. And that certainly varied a lot between individuals. Some people were well below, some people were just a little bit below. The hormones that we looked at were also consistent with what we would expect with contest prep. So leptin was low, testosterone in males was a bit low. Cortisol was high, I think, off the top of my head. But even with the case studies we've done, cortisol is usually high near competition.
Right.
Even if there's no dieting involved, it's just really stressful.
Right. Is that salivary or blood levels?
In the BioLane study, we did saliva. In at least one of the case studies we've done, it was blood. Trying to keep time of day consistent because there's that diurnal rhythm. So the hormone profile was indicative of a person who was really stressed, really hungry, and really tired. And the metabolic rate reflected that. And what we were interested in was watching those change over that immediate recovery period. And what we saw was, and just combining it with a couple case studies we've done since, in that immediate period, one of the things to really look out for is you're going to have a lot of fluctuation in total body water. And so, like, I think we saw was somewhere in the ballpark. I forget the exact value, but we saw that based on the ultrasound body comp we did for that study, it looked like there was quite a big initial increase in lean tissue, but there wasn't. What happens is you get more hydrated, more carbs in your diet, more sodium in your diet, and literally in the first couple of days, you're going to see your body weight change. I mean, often by at least a kilogram, even if you're trying to keep it pretty consistent.
Yeah.
And that's almost exclusively water weight.
Right.
And so the thing to keep in mind is some people after competition are planning for this huge rebound in lean mass.
Sure,
Right?
yeah,
I'm going to die into to rebound with some muscle tissue.
Right.
And the thing that can be tricky with that is a lot of ways you would measure body comp would actually confirm their suspicion, but it would be inaccurate. So, as a competitor and someone who plans to be coaching a lot of people in the future, I think best practice is to budget in a kilogram or two of just immediate water weight and then reassess from there. What was really kind of a bummer was in the post-competition period we saw, aside from the initial increase in water weight, there was really not a lot of lean tissue being rebounded. It was mostly fat mass, which makes sense, but it's still a bit disheartening.
Yeah, it tends to be a little delayed, right? There
seems to be, and that was actually, a researcher named DeLu has talked about this in the past quite a bit, but there seems to be a preferential regain of fat mass in the immediate post-competition period, which I think is probably one of the more applicable findings from the study we did with the BioLane grant. So the main takeaways from that were budget for an initial pretty abrupt increase in water weight, and that's intuitive, but haven't really been documented in the research yet. But also, it's quite unlikely that in that first month or two that you're talking about substantial increases in real lean tissue, besides just rehydration and glycogen replenishment. So I think that helps shift the focus of how your diet should be oriented in the post-competition period. Now, another caveat I want to put on that is certainly in the first month or two we wouldn't expect full recovery. We did see things starting to trend in a positive direction even in that shorter time frame, but a month or two is not even close. Some of the case studies we've done and case studies that other people have done, 4 months, maybe 6 months, you're starting to get in the ballpark where you start to see hormones are near baseline, metabolic rate is near baseline. And so I think it's really important when someone's competing to help them kind of shift their focus.
Right.
I'm about to give a talk in Finland that's only about bodybuilding stuff. And they didn't ask me to talk about post-competition stuff, but I'm going to anyway, because I feel like you have a responsibility.
Sure.
If you're an athlete yourself or if you're prepping an athlete, you can't just act like life ends after the finish line.
Right.
And that's it. You have to have a plan for that. And the way you plan that is going to really significantly influence your timeline of recovery.
Yeah.
And recovery is a lot more important than just getting your bench back to normal.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or filling out your old t-shirts. We're talking about not being starving all the time, getting your energy back, feeling like yourself again.
Yeah.
It's really important to focus on.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, the kind of hyperphagia post-contest a little bit, because I know personally my thyroid levels, and this wasn't a contest, this was just getting pretty lean. My thyroid levels took about 3 months, I would say about 3 months to get back to normal, where they were as far as free T3 levels. They dipped significantly below, the normal ranges. It took a while. And then, of course, a lot of people find that they're hungrier once they start adding those calories back. And so, I mean, just explain a little bit the role of there and, how the fat cells, hopefully there's not a hyperplasia occurring if they go too far with it, but just kind of talk about that if you can.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors to consider with the post-competition diet. And there's a fine line to kind of straddle. If you are too conservative about adding food back in, what you're going to find is things like thyroid hormone, leptin levels, testosterone levels, metabolic rate potentially, they will remain repressed. So some people kind of go in with this mindset that, I'll get into contest shape and stay close in perpetuity. That's my normal now. And that's generally not an advisable way to go about it. Unless your contest shape is nowhere near contest shape, which is also not advisable as a competitor.
Right.
So the fine line there is you need to get back at least to a maintenance and preferably a little bit of a surplus. If you're probably ending your prep still in some kind of a deficit unless you are ready well ahead of time. But certainly you want to give yourself a little bump, accept that little jump in water weight, that's fine. And then you want to start working yourself back to a weight where your body can actually have an opportunity to recover. Now, the other end of that spectrum is, like I said, the old myth of like, after competition, I'm ready to put on a ton of muscle immediately. Hormonally, physiologically, you are not in a spot to be doing that. You really have to recover before you can think of putting on any substantial amounts of lean tissue, because if there's one thing the human body is really good at, it's avoiding starvation in terms of starving to death. So you put your body into an extreme challenge like that, contest prep. The last thing it wants to do is right off the bat gain a bunch of metabolically expensive muscle tissue. It's counterintuitive and it doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. So the idea of just drastically overfeeding after a huge deficit, there is, like you kind of alluded to, a possibility that if we overfill adipocytes too rapidly and they go from empty to all of a sudden this huge influx of stored calories, there is potential that we can see hyperplasia, the addition of entire new fat cells, which is probably not ideal from a long-term perspective.
Sure.
So it's really about finding that balance in the middle where you're facilitating your recovery. You're going to be pushing things like your thyroid hormone, testosterone levels back into your normal range, but not rushing it to the extent that you're going to put on a whole bunch of fat mass that you're going to have to deal with later.
Right. And in your talk coming up, are you planning on discussing how, because it seems from what I've seen that your brain almost seems to ignore, the fact that you have higher levels of leptin and CCK, and you just don't, those satiety signals are kind of just blunted to some degree.
Yeah, that's the part of your question I totally glossed over. I meant to apologize preemptively. I've been writing code all day.
Yeah. Fun.
And when I write code, I can't interact with a human for a day after. It's it's such a puzzle for my brain.
Right.
So the post-competition eating, I think this is a spot where anecdote is helpful. I know for me personally, the 1 year in 2013, I had a terrible post-competition rebound, and the eating had very little to do with satiety, in my opinion. It was a lot more hedonic.
Yeah.
There's, the hot hedonic reward of having abstained from that type of food intake for so long and then having it accessible.
Sure.
That's one aspect. The stresses of post-show life, of going back to normal, certainly kind of feed into some of those stress-related eating behaviors. And honestly, not needing to get on stage in front of people soon. It's one of those things where if you're in my perspective was, there's no way I'm going to be on stage again in less than 3 years. So who cares?
Right.
A bunch of, ham and cheese in my eggs right now sounds really good. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that because I'm not going to be on stage. So I think there's the satiety aspect where, it's going to take leptin time to rebound. Ghrelin it's so variable day to day that, it's going to be up and down no matter what. But those things will take time. But I think the most immediate threat to a sensible post-competition diet is the other sources of eating, the stress-related eating habits, the hedonic eating, things of that nature.
Sure.
I don't know if your experience reflects that or not.
Oh, yeah. Very much so. And actually, I was going to say, you're familiar with the book Body for Life, I'm sure, by Bill Phillips. Yeah. And so I read that when I was 13. That's kind of part of what got me hooked and everything. And I just thought, okay, I have to stick to it. And they recommend having like a cheat day kind of thing once a week. But I just thought, well, I'll just not do that. So I went 12 weeks, my entire summer, just only eating like the perfectly clean foods. And I literally made a list as a 13-year-old kid, as a list of all the foods I was going to eat when I was done. And I just went on a week-long binge when I was done. I went from 130 to 145. And I mean, that was just not a good time. Who knows what damage I did to my body or how many fat cells I might have added. But it was definitely a very unhealthy way to go about it.
Yeah, you hit close to home with the list thing. It's funny, my most recent prep was my most successful prep by far. Best I've ever looked, best I've ever placed. And the rebound was great. I didn't have the whole post-competition blues. It wasn't a stressful time. The diet stuff was great. And with that prep, I did make a list, but I feel like I made it almost because that was almost cathartic, where you're deep in prep and you're like, and I do like flexible dieting in premise, but
Yeah.
I'm a bantamweight natural. I
Right.
mean, you step on stage at like 140, 145. I mean, good luck having
Yeah. How
fun
much
with
can you
your
really fit
macros. Like,
in?
yeah, you
Right.
can't
Right.
fit anything. It's like
Yeah.
an extra serving of broccoli was like, oh, sweet.
Yeah.
So it was almost like therapeutic to like put it on paper and be like, oh, I'll be able to eat these things after competition. It's not a big
Yeah.
deal. They'll help me
Well,
get back to a normal body weight.
yeah.
And I think the best thing about my most recent rebound from competing was um, if you feel good about how you did with the prep and you feel like you're in control of your progress moving forward, it's not a stressful time.
Hmm.
Like if you know to expect, hey, post competition is going to be weird. I'm going to
Yeah.
be super hungry. My hormones are going to be out of whack, and that brings a whole bunch of other issues with it. But if you know it's coming and you just address the challenge head on, it's really not that big of a deal. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I gained a few pounds right off the bat because that's what you're supposed to do. Like,
Yeah. Right.
I,
Right.
I mean, when I was in contest shape, at least 3 people in my department, like professors and faculty members, asked my friends uh, about what horrible diagnosis I was dealing with to make me look
Really.
that bad.
Wow.
I mean, I was wasting away.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's, of course, why would you not want to gain a couple pounds off the bat so you can actually function like a normal person again?
Yeah.
I mean, people
Yeah.
thought I was quite ill.
The psychological aspect of all that, it's tough to deal with. That's probably the hardest part for me. Is I know throughout all of dental school I was, I don't know, 210, 215, and it was like one of the bigger guys, and it was very mentally tough for me to really diet down because for all these years I was seen as that guy, and to go drop 30, 40 pounds. And it's like, what happened to you? Like, oh, do you stop lifting? Like in regular clothes, you just look kind of normal. And psychologically, there's a huge, toll there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's always demoralizing if you're
Yeah.
natural and you're trying to get really, really lean. If you're
Hmm.
wearing normal clothes,
Yeah.
you might not even look like you work out. You
Right.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? And then people will be like, "Oh, hey, it looks like you're not hitting the gym anymore." And you're like,
Right. And you're thinking
"I
like, I'm
actually
putting in
like,
more time than ever.
yeah, you're like,
Yeah.
I actually like totally live for it right now." So
Right.
thanks for that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. So let's get into supplements a little bit. So you're very knowledgeable on a few key supplements, and the first one I wanted to talk about was caffeine. So, let's say the layperson is listening to this and they've never heard of methylxanthine or, adenosine receptor blocker or anything like that. How would you describe some of the effects of caffeine?
Well, I mean, caffeine's effects are pretty multifaceted, pretty widespread. Some of the early papers coming out on caffeine as an exercise enhancer, it was cool because they were like, well, we're trying to figure out exactly how it helps with performance. There's a whole list of reasons we're not really sure. Back in the day, they used to focus more on peripheral stuff. What is the caffeine doing at the muscle level? But all of that research has pretty much worked its way up toward the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So the main thing that caffeine does is it is an adenosine receptor antagonist. It binds to those receptors and displaces adenosine. And so what that does is it gives us feelings of alertness, but it has widespread effects all throughout the body. And that really is the primary dictator of the primary mechanism dictating the effects that we associate with it when it comes to exercise performance, heart rate, alertness, not being able to sleep at night. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it does, but it's such a fascinating compound. There was a really cool paper back in the day where they would they actually took tetraplegics in the lab, gave them caffeine, and then did electronically stimulated muscle contractions.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually found that completely independent of any central, brain-related mechanism feeding down into those muscles. The muscles themselves were being altered by the caffeine,
Wow.
the way that they were contracting. So there's a lot more to it than that, but by and large, that's really what's calling most of the shots.
Gotcha. And you had talked before, I'd seen another interview you had done, and you had mentioned, people have different experiences with the half-life in their own body and how long it lasts and how it affects their sleep. Something that I've noticed, and I've only heard a couple other people mention this, is when I've ever taken a pre-workout or just coffee, I don't seem to have a problem falling asleep, but I will wake up at like 2 or 3 in the morning and just be wide awake. And I haven't come across why that would be, but it's a pretty consistent trend if I ever have pre-workouts.
Yeah. That is, so yeah, I was writing a book chapter, about caffeine, and I had to cover the metabolism section, and I was trying to write down a single clean value for the half-life. And it's just, in the literature, it's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And for the longest time, we weren't really certain why. We're getting a better idea why that is now. But yeah, for most people, the half-life tends to be 5 to 8 hours, which is a pretty extended half-life.
Mm-hmm.
But, that means if you have a huge dose midday, you still have
Right.
a pretty substantial amount in your bloodstream when it's bedtime. Now, one of the things dictating that is the CYP1A2 genotype that you inherited from your parents. And that gene is responsible for the overwhelming majority of caffeine metabolism phenotype, basically. And what we see is some people are slow metabolizers, some are fast, and some are heterozygotes. Generally speaking, if you're a fast metabolizer, you're more likely to be that person that can have caffeine midday, fall asleep, and have no issues throughout the night. If you're more of a slow metabolizer, you're more likely to have a more lingering effect. You're also more likely to have side effects from caffeine, like some people have, if they have a lot of caffeine, they're more prone to anxiety. They're probably slow metabolizers. That's not a rule, but that's a general association between those two factors.
Right.
What's really interesting is that genotype seems to also alter long-term risk. So when people talk about, I think a lot of caffeine might be bad for cardiovascular risk down the road, it seems to be more true in slow metabolizers than in fast metabolizers.
Really? Okay, that makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, and there's not enough research to say anything definitive, but it is leaning, as it comes out, it looks like whether you're a fast or slow metabolizer also influences your ability to get exercise benefits from caffeine, an ergogenic effect.
Yeah.
And the preliminary stuff, and I really like to stress how preliminary it is, preliminary stuff would indicate that fast metabolizers get a better performance boost than slow metabolizers.
Oh, okay.
So the take-home point is, as far as we know right now, across the board, you probably want to be a fast metabolizer.
Right, sounds like it, yeah.
I was talking to my buddy Greg Knuckles about it, and we're both really into lifting and really into coffee. And you can get your genotype tested quite easily, and it's pretty affordable. But I wouldn't, because it doesn't matter. The coffee's here to stay. I hope I'm a fast metabolizer, but even if I had that information, I'm probably not going to do anything about it.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so there's a great deal of variation between people, when it comes to not just your ability to get to sleep, but an often overlooked thing is sleep quality. And it's something that sleep science is really growing a lot. There's a lot of fascinating stuff out there when it comes to blue light exposure, sleep quality, as opposed to just total sleep amount. And so, just because you get to sleep doesn't mean that the caffeine hasn't had an overall deleterious effect on your sleep quality as a whole.
Right.
And that's another thing with bodybuilding, not to switch gears, but time and time again in our studies, and just anecdotally, sleep quality during bodybuilding prep is brutal. Trying to get to sleep and stay asleep. So that's kind of a double-edged sword, where you're prepping for a show. Almost everyone I know that's prepping is totally abusing stimulants. And so you couldn't sleep anyway, but now that you're taking stimulants all day, now you just really don't have a chance.
Yeah, I haven't had, unfortunately, and I miss it all the time, I haven't really had coffee in probably a good year or two. And even so, my sleep, not at the start of the diet, but within a few months, it's because I'm already a very light sleeper. I'm doing everything. When I actually moved to North Carolina, I thought it was going to be great because I was moving from a city to kind of a smaller area. I got the blackout shades and everything, no sound around me. I would still wake up 3 times in the middle of the night. So when I was dieting, that got rough. And I would say maybe half the nights I would get maybe 5 or 6, and then I try to catch up, but it does get tough, and I'm sure with stimulants it's even harder.
Yeah.
Now, have you noticed, it seems like there's a difference in terms of the habituation aspect from the euphoria people get from caffeine versus the actual stimulation and alertness. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah. So when it comes to habituation with caffeine, like I said, caffeine's effects in the body are multifaceted. It affects a lot of different sensations, a lot of different processes. Um, Habituation doesn't seem to be just across the board type thing. It seems like some effects of caffeine are more prone to habituation than others. Now, when it comes to performance, I gave a talk in Chicago about supplements, and this came up, and it kind of sucks when you can't give people a very clear-cut, simple answer, but the habituation research with caffeine and performance is a little bit messy. There's some studies showing, it looks like the normal coffee drinkers had less of a performance benefit than people who never have caffeine. In other studies, it looks like it has no effect at all. The most recent study on it was called something about killing the myth that habituation affects performance outcomes. It was a bit strongly worded, but I tend to think people who habitually take in caffeine, it looks like they can still benefit when it comes to performance from a pre-exercise dose of caffeine. Whether or not there might be a small reduction because they're a habitual user, that's kind of open to your interpretation of which of those studies you feel is most definitive. But sometimes people say, you have to restrict all your caffeine intake to get a performance boost. Unequivocally, it looks like the research would say that's not the case. Okay. And in some cases, habituation is not a bad thing. So a lot of times people worry about the diuretic effect of caffeine intake, and that effect seems to be quite prone to habituation in the sense that the diuresis we see after ingesting caffeine seems to really taper off when we're a habitual user. Not that it's a big deal in the first place, but it's nice to not have a super pronounced diuretic effect.
Right. So the last time I'd seen the research as far as caffeine and creatine, I think there was a lot of information showing that it seemed to kind of cancel out the effects as far as the ergogenic benefit there. Maybe you can update me as what the research now is showing, if there's anything new there.
Well, there's nothing new, which is frustrating.
Yeah.
I did a project on it back in the day, and probably more importantly, I talked to Roger Harris about it. And Roger Harris essentially invented creatine. I mean, he did the initial study saying, hey, what if we started giving this to people? I think it might help their muscles. So Roger Harris is a legend, and I talked to him about it, and if you look back at the research on it, they originally tried to do this stuff. They tried to give caffeine with creatine because they thought it was going to enhance creatine's effect. They thought it would help with uptake, and what they found in the first study they did was actually the group that only got creatine had a performance benefit, but the group that got creatine and caffeine together actually had no effect greater than placebo.
Right.
And so they're like, well, that's weird, and they followed up on another study and found something similar. And Roger Harris followed up later, and he's like, no, you guys are, I don't think that's legit. They did a study, and they actually kind of found the same thing.
Wow.
But the question is, there's not a ton of evidence on it. A lot of people are resistant to acknowledge the evidence that's out there. The question is, why might that be the case? So some authors have said that they think that caffeine and creatine have divergent effects on the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That they think the way that the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases and reuptakes calcium, it's getting opposing effects from caffeine and creatine, and that's what's canceling out the effects on muscle performance. Roger Harris has a much simpler approach. He is and I mean, this is a personal conversation we had, so it's not like he's going out and, writing about it, but he seemed a lot more, it seemed like his take was more that gastrointestinal discomfort is more likely when you have a high dose of caffeine with your creatine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even in the abstract that they published on their project they did, they mentioned like, yeah, creatine with caffeine, we had a lot of people complain that there's upset stomach.
Yeah.
And obviously your performance is not going to be at your all-time best if, your stomach hurts and you feel
Right.
sick. So the state of the evidence, to kind of wrap it all together, there has not been a lot of research directly investigating it. The ones that I've looked at it directly seem to indicate that there might be some kind of interference there. It may be happening at the muscle level. It might just be the fact that people are trying to do an exercise test with a bellyache.
Right. Could be.
Now, the thing that's important to note, and the reason that everyone's so hesitant to accept this research, a lot of the early studies on creatine, they would say, go ahead and mix this into your morning coffee because it's hot and it'll dissolve better. These are all the early creatine studies showing, hey, this helps with muscle performance and strength and power. So the thing that we have to reconcile looking at this body of literature is that most of our creatine, most of our early studies, they were mixing it in caffeinated coffee.
Interesting. Okay.
And it worked. Now you have to work around the fact that coffee is not the same as caffeine powder.
Right.
You have to work around the fact that an ergogenic dose of caffeine is substantially higher than a typical single cup of coffee in the morning. There's a lot of factors to reconcile there, and honestly, I don't think the body of evidence is ready for a super definitive conclusion.
Right.
And people don't like that, but sorry, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So I think to give a take-home point, if you like creatine and you like caffeine, one thing you can do, let's just go with the idea that it really is a stomach discomfort thing. I would say separating out your daily doses is prudent.
Mm-hmm.
If it is an issue, you'll get around it. If it's not an issue, everything will still work fine anyway. So I usually say if you're worried about that interaction, I think you can still use both well. I say take your caffeine before your workout, 30 to 90 minutes before, and then take your creatine either directly post-workout or sometime later in the day. And I think by separating the doses, if it is a stomach discomfort thing, you've alleviated that risk.
Gotcha. Great.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious what your experience with this is I personally never responded to creatine. And, I had friends, and they tell me right away they're gaining, 3 to 5 pounds of water weight and all of that. I've tried many different brands. I never noticed when I start it, and I never noticed when I stop it. I believe the research shows a roughly 30% non-responder rate. I could be remembering that incorrectly. But based on the people you've trained and work with, what do you find that, like, how many people or percentage respond or don't respond?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. So I've never responded.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never seen my body weight change acutely, even with the loading phase. I've never seen my performance to change substantially.
Yeah.
So I believe I'm a non-responder. But again, what we're talking about here with a non-responder is that your muscle is fully saturated without adding it as a supplement, which either means you have, you have high natural muscle content, and if your diet tends to be a little bit higher in creatine, that'll also affect that. We see that typically vegetarians have a little bit lower.
Right.
The challenge of trying to assess how many people are non-responders is the very premise of the placebo effect. So, like, if I ask my client, hey, did that work? It's what we would basically call a single subject open label study. They know exactly what they took, and they know exactly what it's supposed to do.
Right.
So we're all biased whether we want to be or not. And there's no way to talk yourself out of your own bias, no matter how hard you try. So if you're super skeptical by nature, you're probably going to be a non-responder.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're super gullible by nature in this particular realm, you're probably going to be like, wow, I can't believe I ever trained without it.
Right.
One of the things that's tricky with the putting a population number on it is, one of the first studies that tried to approximate this is how many people were non-responders. I don't think they ever intended to make it a population value. I mean, this is small sample research by nature, which means that to say that, yeah, these 22 people approximately, resemble the world population. I don't know anybody who wants to go out on that limb.
Right.
So what they were really saying was within our sample, it looks like, 20, 30% we didn't get an effect. But with small samples, a statistic like that has to be taken with a grain of salt.
Right.
The problem is you're never going to get a big sample study on that. It's just never going to happen. Whether you want to do muscle biopsies, which are super invasive, or you want to do like magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which is super expensive, there's huge hurdles from a practical perspective of saying, hey, let's bring in 15,000 people like NHANES and figure out what a normal creatine level is within the muscle tissue. So there's challenges there, which it could be answered, but I'm pretty comfortable using the small sample estimate as a rough guideline, and then letting people's experiences dictate whether or not we feel like we really got a tangible benefit from it.
Sure. Yeah, the placebo thing is a very interesting topic. Maybe we can get you back on to discuss placebo and sleep and some other things. But I've noticed that, I am very skeptical by nature. And it does, now that you say it, it does kind of seem to be that my more, I guess, scientifically minded, skeptical friends aren't responding as well. And my friends who are kind of just, buying up all the supplements, kind of like the typical pro lifters, they seem to really rave to me about their responses. So maybe there's something there.
Yeah. Well, my lifting experience was cultivated. Like I was a 12-year-old who was just lifting with football players and wrestlers on my team.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you the number of supplements that have come and gone that everyone in the gym got on and said, I can't believe I trained without, 15 grams of ketamine or 10 grams of arginine. And it's just like, the more we do research on them, we just can't identify much of a benefit.
Right.
And
yeah.
So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about nitric oxide boosters there. So I know you're familiar with those, obviously, and it seems, obviously everybody likes to get the pump and everything, but as far as long-term benefits from it, are we seeing that now?
We're not seeing anything long-term because we're not looking at it. So if you look at the nitric oxide supplement literature, there's just not much that looks at long-term outcomes. It's usually, we brought you into a lab, we gave you some citrulline malate, we had you do a bunch of bench press an hour later. So we don't really have a body of literature in which we're giving people like citrulline malate or beetroot juice for 8, 12, 16 weeks, training them and seeing if it's actually contributing to their muscle growth or their strength gains over time. For now, the literature we have, we can look at the acute short-term response. That's just all we've got to go with right now.
Yeah.
And with citrulline malate, there's quite a few studies out there showing if we give it to you an hour later, you do more repetitions before you fail. So, we had you do 3 sets of bench to failure. We added up all the reps. You got a few more with citrulline than you did with the placebo. And the premise there no one really cares if they got 3 more reps that day.
Right.
I think the premise there is that you're doing more overall training volume, and that over time, that's going to contribute to more muscle growth and more strength adaptation. The premise makes sense, but we still need to see how much those few extra reps really contribute. There was a similar study done with beetroot juice, but there's only one of them, where they gave beetroot juice and then, some amount, I forget exactly how they timed it in that study, but then they did a single bout of, repetitions to fatigue, and it did the same exact thing. A few more reps before you fail. There's some mechanistic arguments that you could make, saying that nitric oxide would generally contribute to muscle growth. The problem is there's very mechanistic evidence from like animal models or like cell culture kind of models or like extracted fibers where we could say, oh, nitric oxide plays a role in this. The question is, does going from a normal nitric oxide level to a slightly higher one from supplementation, is that enough to really affect the grand scheme of things, the overall magnitude of growth? So like there's some stuff in animals where they say, hey, we completely blocked all endogenous nitric oxide production or virtually all of it, and it blunted their muscle growth. That would indicate nitric oxide plays a role, but that doesn't mean necessarily that increasing it from normal to a little bit above normal is going to do anything tangible. So we really just need some more research to be done on it.
Right. And you mentioned the premise there, the kind of the theory behind it. And that's something that I've actually wondered for years. I mean, even since college, and with creatine and anything where they say, okay, they took this supplement and, they got 2 more reps, let's say. And I'd really be interested to hear what you think about this, because to me, let's say somebody takes their, some lift from 100 pounds for 10 reps to 150 pounds for 10 reps. The hypertrophy comes from that, in part from that change, is that increase there. So let's say they took creatine and they went from 100 for 12 reps to 150 for 12 reps. That change is about the same. So I would wonder, is that person, even if they respond to creatine and they get those initial increased reps, if over the course of those years or however long that took, you're still getting that increase in 50 pounds or whatever, would that really net in that much more hypertrophy unless you were going from, that increase was going that whole time? I hope that makes sense the way I'm wording that.
Yeah. I think basically the question is, when you look at the millions of tons of training volume that occur over a lifting career, did those 2 extra reps from your creatine matter?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good question. I think one of the things to keep in mind with supplements across the board, and I say this every time I publicly talk about them, is we're talking about small effects, like eerie. Depending on how much faith you put into standardized effect sizes, you're not going to find a supplement that consistently has like a Cohen's D value above 0.2, 0.4. You'll see instances where they're a little bit higher than that, but that's pretty much what we're looking at. It's a small effect in the short term, which can only be thought to culminate to a small effect in the long term. But the question is, how much do you care about small effects?
Right.
And how small is that effect? Unfortunately, we're kind of extrapolating because we don't really have anything to go with in terms of just thinking of the logistical nightmare that it would be to try to approximate over the course of a really tangible time frame of a year, 2 years. Those types of long-term training studies with a supplement mixed in, they don't take place.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I've done a ton of research. And even when I was like full-blown research, had virtually nothing else going on in terms of actual application or anything, it's crazy to think that we can't learn from people that are out there day to day with athletes who are applying this stuff and actually getting that several years of feedback. So I would say a small effect, if you're a super intense athlete who wants to do whatever, any small edge they can get on the competition, I think there's instances where supplementation does make sense and could contribute to long-term having a slightly higher ceiling for your adaptations. How much that matters to you is more of it depends on what you're training for and how much you're willing to invest in a small difference.
Yeah, and I think as long as people understand that it is small, they can make that educated decision. I think the problem is when, you've got Super Pump 250 for $100 a month because, they're told that if you really want that edge, you've got to get that. And I think I don't remember who I was talking to, but somebody was telling me how they thought the supplements only gave them an extra 10 pounds of muscle. And it was just like, if you thought those supplements gave you 10 pounds of muscle in any reasonable time frame, I mean, I don't know, maybe you would disagree, but I think that's kind of crazy to think it would make that much of a difference. But as long as, like you said, as long as people understand, then it's really up to them how much they want to put into it.
Yeah. I think another thing to keep in mind is that not everyone views their training career as a kind of trajectory leading to some steady state status. And what I mean by that is there might be certain times in your athletic career where you're like, for the next 3 months, I'm all in. I'm pushing to some kind of competitive endpoint. And
Yeah.
during this time, it might make a lot more sense to be kind of more invested in my supplement regimen because we are leading up to an event in which we're trying to peak. And so in those instances, like, yeah, if you said, oh, I took creatine, you didn't, over the next 10 years, who gains the most muscle? I don't know if everyone views their supplementation that way.
Right.
I think for some people, it's more, I'm doing a contest prep. I'm going to be in a state where muscle loss is a very pertinent concern. What can I do to make sure that I'm not losing out on training volume over the next 12 weeks?
Sure.
So I think that's probably the more sensible way to look at it is short-term, focusing in for this chunk of time. We're pushing with everything we got up to this peak. And so, like, I know for me, there's certain times where I take more supplements and some when I take less.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So that pretty much wraps it up today. My last question here is just, everybody listening to this, we've covered a lot of topics here, but somebody who wants to make the most of, let's say, the next 3 months, like you were saying, what's your next actionable step for those people listening?
To make the most of their next 3 months.
Yeah, let's say, like you were saying, they're trying to put everything into this. Main advice there. It's a broad question, so you can take it any way you want.
I would say it's all about consistency. And especially for someone making a big push, being consistent. So, like, a terrible workout is substantially better than no workout. And then on the flip side, there's nothing you can do in a single workout that's going to absolutely change your performance or change your physique. But there aren't things you can do in a single workout to completely ruin them. So if you're in the next 3 months, if you're feeling lazy and you're not super motivated, remember, just getting there and doing something is better than nothing. Mm-hmm. If you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're going nuts for the next 3 months and killing yourself in the gym, remember, one extra rep probably doesn't matter that much, but tearing your pec on that rep does. So don't put yourself in a sling or on crutches because there's some end point coming up.
Okay, great advice. So this was Eric Trexler, and where can people find you?
So I've got a Facebook. I'm on Facebook more than any other social media.
Okay.
Just Eric Trexler. Twitter @Eric Trexler. Instagram @Trexler Fitness. I've got a ResearchGate page if you want to see some of the research I've done. Yeah, I'm kind of all over. And when I finish up my PhD this year, I'll be going into business with Greg Nuckols and working for a company called Stronger by Science. So I'll certainly be very reachable with all the Stronger by Science platforms. And I'm stoked. Like I said, the last 6 years, it's been doing just a ton of research. And I'm really excited about being able to do more stuff like this where it's not just living in the lab, but it's actually bringing research to the people trying to apply it and trying to make it accessible and turn a research question into an actionable, practical thing that people can use.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm actually really excited to see the work you put out because I know getting your PhD, you're kind of just locked in there all the time. And I feel like you're going to be one of the big influences in this industry. So I'm excited to see what you've got.
All right. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, thanks for talking, man.
Yeah.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed nerding out with Eric Trexler as much as I did. If you have other topics that you'd like to see covered, please feel free to comment down below, like the video, and subscribe for more interviews. And if you like the cause that he had mentioned today, please feel free to make a donation as well.